the spring of 1741, the city of New York put more of its own residents to death on charges of conspiracy than any other city in the history of British North America. 17 people were hanged. 13 more were burned alive at the stake, tied to iron posts on a patch of open ground north of the city wall. More than 70 others were forced onto ships and sent away from everything they knew, sold into slavery in the Caribbean, or exiled from the only home some of them had ever had. The youngest person convicted was a boy of 16. The trials that produced these numbers lasted through the summer of 1741, and they were built almost entirely on the word of a single teenage girl, an indentured servant with a history of lying to get out of trouble, who was offered her freedom in exchange for testimony. By the time the courts finished, more than 150 New Yorkers had been arrested. Judges accepted confessions extracted through the promise of mercy and the threat of the stake. A school teacher was hanged for allegedly being a secret Catholic priest in a city that had no functioning Catholic church and had not seen an ordained priest in years. No conspiracy on this scale has ever been proven to have existed. What can be proven is smaller and in some ways stranger. A string of fires, a citywide panic already primed by war and by memory, and a legal process that turned suspicion into confession and confession into execution, one case at a time. This is the story of how that happened and of the machinery it left behind. This is Quiet History at Bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. New York in 1741 was not yet the city it would become. It occupied only the southern tip of Manhattan Island, a cluster of brick and timber buildings pressed close to the harbor, with open farmland beginning just a few blocks north of Wall Street. The population numbered around 11,000 people. Of those, roughly 1 in 5 was enslaved, making New York's enslaved population by proportion larger than that of any other city in the northern colonies. By comparison, Boston and Philadelphia, the two other major population centers of British North America at the time, held far smaller enslaved populations relative to their overall size, a difference rooted in New York's origins as a Dutch trading colony where slavery had been embedded in the economy from its earliest decades under the name New Amsterdam. When the English took control of the colony in 1664, they inherited both the enslaved population and the legal framework that governed it, and expanded both over the following decades as the port grew. Slavery in New York did not resemble the plantation system that was hardening in the South during the same decades. There were no large agricultural estates within the city itself, no fields of tobacco or rice worked by hundreds of laborers under a single owner. Instead, enslaved people in New York worked the docks, loaded and unloaded ships, labored in blacksmith shops and shipyards, and performed domestic work inside the homes of merchants and artisans. Ownership was widespread and small in scale. A tradesman might own 1 enslaved person. A wealthy merchant might own 4 or 5. This pattern of ownership meant that skilled trades in New York depended heavily on enslaved labor, working alongside free apprentices and journeymen, often performing the same tasks under the same roof. Bakers, coopers, blacksmiths, and shipwrights across the city listed enslaved workers among their household property in tax and probate records from the period, a detail that later made it easier for prosecutors to imagine a citywide network, since enslaved men from dozens of separate households already crossed paths daily through the ordinary business of the trades they served. This structure meant that enslaved and free people in New York lived in closer physical proximity than in southern colonies, sharing streets, taverns, and marketplaces in ways that plantation slavery did not allow. That proximity was not the product of tolerance. It was the product of a labor economy that needed enslaved workers integrated into a dense urban environment. Proximity did not soften the legal status of enslaved people. It sharpened the anxiety of the white population that governed them, because it meant enslaved people were never far from information, from each other, or from the tools a city provided. Physically, the city was small enough that this proximity was unavoidable. New York in 1741 was organized into 6 wards, its streets narrow and mostly unpaved, running from the Battery at the island's tip up to a wooden palisade wall along what is now Wall Street, beyond which lay open commons, farmland, and a body of fresh water known as the Collect. The docks along the East River were the city's economic engine, lined with warehouses, cooperages, and shipyards, and it was here, more than anywhere else, that enslaved laborers, free black sailors, indentured servants, and white dock workers worked side by side, loading and unloading the same vessels. City Hall stood at the corner of Wall and Nassau Streets, and it was there, in a building meant to project colonial order, that the machinery of the 1741 trials would eventually be assembled. New York's government had already answered a slave revolt once before, and the memory of that answer shaped everything about how the city responded to fear in 1741. In April of 1712, a group of enslaved New Yorkers set fire to a building on Maiden Lane and attacked the white residents who came to put it out. 9 white colonists were killed before the colonial militia suppressed the uprising. In the aftermath, 21 enslaved people were executed, some by hanging, others by burning, and 1 man was left to starve to death in chains as a public display. Governor Robert Hunter, who oversaw the colony at the time, wrote to London describing the punishments in detail, noting that the severity was intended less as justice for the 9 deaths than as a demonstration to the colony's remaining enslaved population of what coordinated resistance would cost. That letter, preserved in the Colonial Records Office, became part of the institutional memory that later officials, including those who would preside over the 1741 trials, inherited along with their posts. The legal response to the 1712 revolt was the Black Code of 1712, a body of law that restricted the movement, assembly, and legal standing of enslaved people far beyond what had existed before. Enslaved people could no longer gather in groups of more than 3 without permission. They could not carry firearms. They could not testify in court against a white person, though they could be compelled to testify against each other. Manumission, the legal freeing of an enslaved person, was made deliberately difficult and expensive, requiring a bond posted by the former owner to guarantee the freed person would not become a public burden. The Black Code also established a strict evening curfew. Enslaved people found on the street after dark, without a lantern or without written permission from their owner, could be jailed on sight, and repeated violations carried corporal punishment set by statute rather than by a judge's discretion. Enforcement of these laws fell partly to a citizen watch and partly to constables who patrolled the wards at night, and by 1741 this patrol structure was a routine, unremarkable part of city life. It existed specifically because the 1712 revolt had convinced the colonial government that unsupervised movement among enslaved people was itself a form of danger, independent of any specific crime. By 1741, the generation that remembered 1712 directly was aging out, but the legal and psychological architecture that revolt had built was still fully in place. The city's leadership had been trained, by law and by memory, to interpret any sign of coordinated activity among enslaved people as the possible opening act of another uprising. Into this environment came two additional pressures, arriving almost simultaneously in the years just before 1741, and both originating far from New York itself. The first was economic. The winter of 1740 into 1741 was one of the coldest in living memory along the eastern seaboard. The harbor froze solid enough in places to be crossed on foot, halting shipping for weeks at a time in a city entirely dependent on maritime trade. Grain shortages followed, driving up the price of bread and flour through the winter and into the spring. Poor laborers, both free and enslaved, felt the shortage first and most severely, and the tavern culture of the city's waterfront became, if anything, more crowded, as people with little money and little food gathered in the few places that offered warmth, credit, and company. The city's Common Council responded to the shortage by restricting the export of grain from the port, a measure meant to keep flour available locally. But the restriction did little to lower prices for laborers who were paid in wages that had not moved in years. Poor relief, administered through the churches and the almshouse, was stretched thin enough that petitions for aid rose sharply through the early months of 1741, a detail preserved in the Common Council's own minutes from that winter. For enslaved people, the hardship was compounded rather than shared equally, since a bad winter did not reduce the labor expected of them, only the food and warmth available to sustain it. For the white laboring poor, many of whom competed directly with enslaved workers for the same dock and trade work, the winter sharpened an existing resentment, one that would later surface, unspoken but present, in the willingness of poor white residents to believe accusations against their black neighbors rather than question them. The second pressure was war. In 1739, Britain and Spain entered a conflict that would become known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, a dispute over trade rights and smuggling in the Caribbean that quickly widened into a broader colonial contest. New York, as a major port, was directly affected. Privateers sailed out of the harbor to raid Spanish shipping, and Spanish sailors captured at sea were brought back to the city as prisoners. A number of these captured sailors were free black men from Spanish colonies, men who under Spanish law held free status, but who, once landed in New York, were treated as enslaved property and sold or held in bondage, regardless of their prior legal standing. Privateering was also, for the merchants who financed it, a source of considerable profit, since a captured Spanish vessel and its cargo could be sold at auction under a legal process known as condemnation, splitting the proceeds between the ship's owners, its crew, and the crown. This meant the war was not simply a distant conflict discussed in newspapers. It was an active local industry, one that filled the harbor with captured ships, foreign prisoners, and sailors flush with sudden prize money, all of it concentrated in the same waterfront neighborhood where Hewson kept his tavern. This detail mattered more than it might first appear. It placed inside the city, in the months leading up to the fires, a small population of black men who had recently been free, who had reason to resent the colony that had stripped that status from them, and who spoke openly about the injustice of their situation. To a white population already primed by the memory of 1712, their presence read less as a grievance and more as a warning sign. Compounding this was news that had traveled north from South Carolina. In September of 1739, enslaved people near the Stono River had risen up, killed more than 20 white colonists, and attempted to march toward Spanish Florida, where the Spanish crown had promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped British territory. Some accounts placed the number of enslaved participants at close to 100 by the time the group was intercepted, marching openly under a banner and beating drums, an image that reached northern newspapers within weeks and lost none of its power in the retelling. The Stono Rebellion was crushed within days, but word of it spread through every port city on the eastern seaboard over the following months, carried by ship captains, merchants, and newspapers. South Carolina's legislature responded with its own harsher slave code within a year, and reports of that new law traveled alongside reports of the rebellion itself, reinforcing for New York's officials the sense that the entire British colonial system was under a shared and growing threat. New York's leadership read the reports and drew a direct line between Spain's promise of freedom in the South and the presence of Spanish-speaking black prisoners in their own harbor. The colony's legal structure would prove just as important as its social one. New York was governed by a royal governor appointed from London, assisted by a council of prominent colonists, while day-to-day justice ran through a mayor's court and, for serious crimes, a court of oyer and terminer, a special tribunal convened specifically to hear and determine major criminal cases. It was this special court, not the ordinary mayor's court, that colonial officials would convene once the fires of 1741 escalated, a choice that concentrated enormous power in the hands of a small number of judges, and gave the proceedings a formality that made acquittal politically difficult once the process was underway. Religious suspicion added a further layer beneath the surface of daily life. New York's official religious establishment was Anglican, and colonial law treated Catholicism with open hostility, a legacy of English fears about Catholic Spain and Catholic France that predated the colony itself. Catholic priests were barred by statute from entering New York at all, and the mere accusation of secret Catholic sympathy, or of being a Jesuit operating in disguise, carried the weight of treason in the popular imagination, whether or not any evidence supported it. In a city now at war with Catholic Spain and watching that war deliver Spanish, and by assumption Catholic, prisoners into its harbor, this suspicion was primed and waiting for a target. At the center of the neighborhood where much of this tension would eventually surface stood a tavern owned by a cordwainer named John Hewson, near the west side of the city, close to the Hudson River shore. Hewson's tavern was, by design and by necessity, one of the only places in New York where enslaved people, free black residents, and poor white laborers could sit at the same table. Colonial law technically prohibited tavern keepers from serving enslaved people without their owner's permission, and prohibited the purchase of goods from enslaved people without proof of legitimate ownership. Hewson ignored both restrictions as a matter of business practice. His tavern functioned as an informal marketplace where enslaved men could sell stolen goods, drink on credit, and gather without the direct supervision that governed their daily labor. The goods that moved through Hewson's back room were, by later court testimony, ordinary items rather than anything resembling weapons or contraband tied to rebellion. Bolts of linen, silver spoons, jewelry, and coin taken from the homes and shops where enslaved men worked. Hewson resold these goods, or held them for later sale, and in exchange he extended credit, food, and a place to gather that no one else in the city was willing to offer. His wife, Sarah, and his daughter were also present in the household and, according to later testimony, were aware of and participated in this trade. Living and working under Hewson's roof was a 16-year-old indentured servant named Mary Burton, bound to Hewson's household under a contract that gave him near total control over her labor and her movement until her term of service ended. Also present at the tavern, though not living there, was a young Irish immigrant woman named Margaret Carey, known locally as Peggy, who worked as a prostitute and who was reported to be in a relationship with an enslaved man named Caesar, owned by a baker named John Vark. Caesar worked the docks and, through his connection to Hewson's tavern, had built a network of associates that included another enslaved man named Prince, owned by a merchant named Mr. Oboino, along with several other enslaved men who moved regularly through the same waterfront circuit of taverns, warehouses, and ship landings. Caesar, in particular, was known among dock workers for his physical strength and was frequently hired out by Vark for heavy labor, which gave him a degree of movement through the city that more closely supervised enslaved people did not have. This network, built on shared labor, shared confinement, and the rare freedom of a tavern's back room, would soon become the foundation on which prosecutors constructed a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything these men had actually organized. None of this, on its own, was unusual for a colonial port city under economic strain. Taverns like Hewson's existed in every major city of the period. Petty theft, unauthorized gatherings, and informal trade between enslaved people and poor whites were common enough that colonial authorities treated them as a persistent nuisance rather than an emergency. In an ordinary year, a magistrate might have prosecuted Hewson for receiving stolen goods, fined him, and closed the tavern for a period of months. Cases of this kind moved through New York's courts regularly, leaving behind the same pattern each time: a merchant's complaint, a search, a small trial, a modest punishment, and the slow return of business as usual once the fine was paid. What changed the calculation? What turned an ordinary pattern of urban friction into a citywide catastrophe began on the morning of March 18, 1741, when smoke was seen rising from the roof of Fort George, the residence of New York's lieutenant governor, standing at the southern tip of Manhattan, where the city's authority was most concentrated. The fire that started there did not, by itself, kill anyone or prove anything, but it was the first thread in a chain that would, within a matter of weeks, pull the entire city into a spiral of suspicion, confession, and execution that no one involved could have predicted, and that few of them would survive. Within the fort's walls were the offices of the Colonial Secretary, the council chamber, and a chapel used by the city's small Anglican congregation, along with the private apartments of Lieutenant Governor George Clark, who was in residence at the time. The fire spread quickly through the wooden interior before it could be contained, and by the time it was finally extinguished, a significant portion of the fort's records and furnishings had been destroyed. No one in that first week spoke of conspiracy. A chimney fire, a dropped ember, a fault in a stovepipe. These were the explanations offered in the days immediately following, and they were reasonable ones, since fires of accidental origin were common in a city built largely of wood and heated through the winter by open flame. It was only what happened next, fire after fire in rapid succession across unrelated parts of the city, that made an accidental explanation feel increasingly implausible to the people living through it. Within days, the question on every street in New York would shift from what had caused the fire at the fort to what or who was causing all of them. 7 days passed between the fire at Fort George and the next one, long enough that the city's alarm had nearly settled by the time smoke was seen again. In that quiet week, the fort's fire was already being filed away by most residents as a closed matter, one more entry in a city's ordinary run of accidents. On March 25th, a warehouse near the fort belonging to a sea captain caught fire in the middle of the day, destroying a store of pitch, tar, and rigging supplies used to outfit ships for the harbor. New York in 1741 had no professional fire department. Fires were fought by bucket brigades, formed on the spot from whoever was nearby, passing water hand to hand from the nearest well or cistern, while a church bell rang to summon additional help from across the city. This system worked reasonably well for a single, isolated fire, but it depended entirely on speed and on enough able-bodied residents being close enough to respond before a fire spread beyond control. It offered no defense at all against the possibility that fires might begin to appear faster than bucket brigades could be organized to answer them. 2 fires inside a single week, both close to the waterfront, both involving flammable naval stores, were still within the range of coincidence for a city that depended on exactly those materials for its livelihood. Pitch and tar were kept in every shipyard and warehouse along the East River, and fires involving them were not new to New York's fire records. The financial cost of the 2 fires, tallied by the Common Council in the weeks that followed, ran into several £100 between lost cargo, damaged buildings, and the naval stores that could not be replaced before ships already contracted for spring voyages were due to sail. For merchants operating on tight margins between one shipping season and the next, a loss of that size was not abstract, and it gave the earliest fires an economic urgency that predated any suspicion of deliberate arson. What followed made coincidence harder to accept. On April 1st, a fire broke out in the home of Winant Van Zandt, a merchant whose house stood several blocks from either of the first 2 locations, in a part of the city with no obvious connection to the docks or naval stores at all. 4 days later, on April 4th, a haystack near the barracks caught fire, followed within hours by a fire in a cow stable belonging to a sergeant stationed in the city. 2 fires on unrelated properties, on the same day, owned by people with no connection to each other beyond living in the same small city, pushed the pattern from unusual into alarming. The following day, April 5th, brought the fire that changed the city's response entirely. Within a span of hours, flames broke out at the stable of Adolph Phillips, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, and shortly afterward at a stable belonging to a resident named Joseph Hilton, several streets away. Phillips's stable housed several horses and a store of feed and tack that together represented a considerable investment, and its loss, coming from one of the city's most prominent citizens, carried a different weight in the Common Council's deliberations than a fire at a modest tradesman's property might have. That a man of Phillips's standing could lose property to fire on the very same day as an ordinary resident across town suggested to the council that whatever was happening respected no distinction of wealth or rank. At Hilton's stable, a woman named Abigail Earle, who lived nearby, reported seeing an enslaved man named Cuffy running from the direction of the fire before it was discovered by anyone else. According to her account, given to authorities within hours of the fire, Cuffy had been seen leaping a fence away from the burning stable, and she reported hearing him say words to the effect that the fire would burn and burn again before anyone managed to stop it. Cuffy was owned by a baker named Adolph Phillips's neighbor, a man named Vark's associate, and was already known to city officials from earlier, unrelated complaints about disorderly conduct near the docks. Earle's account was the first specific accusation connecting a named individual to an active fire, rather than a general suspicion about the enslaved population as a whole, and it spread through the city within hours. By evening on April 5th, versions of Earle's story were circulating that had already grown beyond what she had originally reported, with some accounts claiming Cuffy had been seen carrying a burning coal in his hand, a detail that does not appear in her original statement to the constables. This pattern, an account expanding slightly with each retelling, would repeat itself at a far larger scale within weeks, but its first appearance was here, in the hours after a single stable fire, among neighbors trading rumor on a city street. Constables who took Earle's original statement noted no mention of a coal or any object in Cuffy's hands, a discrepancy that went unremarked in the excitement of the following days. The gap between what a witness first says and what a city later remembers her saying would prove, over the coming weeks, to be one of the quiet engines driving the entire affair forward. 5 fires in 18 days, the last one witnessed in progress by a named accuser pointing to a named man, was more than New York's civic leadership was prepared to treat as accident. Lieutenant Governor George Clark convened an emergency session of the Common Council on the evening of April 5th, and the council's minutes from that meeting record a shift in language, from discussing fire prevention to discussing what they termed a possible design against the city. The council's first official act was to offer a reward, structured in a way that reveals exactly how the city understood the threat it believed it was facing. Any white person who provided information leading to a conviction would receive £100, a substantial sum equivalent to roughly a year's wages for a skilled tradesman. Any enslaved person who came forward with information would receive freedom and £20, a proclamation read aloud in public places across the city over the following days. Any indentured servant or convict who informed would receive their freedom outright, along with the same monetary reward offered to free informants, a provision that applied directly to Mary Burton's own situation within Hewson's household. This reward structure did something specific and consequential. It did not simply ask people to report what they had seen. It offered the single greatest prize available in colonial society, freedom itself, in exchange for testimony against other enslaved and bound people, at a moment when the city was primed to believe almost any accusation offered to it. For someone bound by servitude with little other path to freedom, the incentive to produce testimony, whether entirely true, partly true, or invented under pressure, was enormous, and it existed before a single formal interrogation had even taken place. The Common Council's own minutes show some awareness of this danger, if only in passing. A note recorded alongside the proclamation acknowledged that testimony obtained under promise of reward would need to be weighed carefully against corroborating evidence, a caution that magistrates would, in practice, abandon almost entirely once the interrogations began in earnest weeks later. Patrols through the city increased immediately, manned by the militia and by armed citizens who had not previously been part of the night watch. Reports from the following days describe enslaved people being stopped and questioned on sight, regardless of whether they were engaged in any suspicious activity. And several accounts describe crowds gathering around individual black residents on suspicion alone, without any specific accusation attached. One such incident, recorded in the days after the Common Council's session, involved a group of enslaved men returning from the docks who were surrounded by a crowd near the fly market, questioned loudly about their movements that day, and released only after their owners were sent for to vouch for them. No formal charge followed, but the incident illustrated how quickly ordinary movement through the city had become, for enslaved residents, a matter that could draw a hostile crowd without warning. Ordinary daily life across the city adjusted visibly to the new atmosphere. Shopkeepers began closing earlier than usual. Several households reportedly began keeping a member awake through the night in rotation to watch for smoke, and a number of residents who could afford to do so moved valuables out of the city entirely, sending them to relatives on Long Island or up the Hudson until the danger, whatever its source, had passed. Owners of enslaved people faced a different, more immediate calculation. A man like John Vark, who owned Caesar, or Mr. Oboino, who owned Prince, held not only a labor asset, but a considerable financial investment in the men now under suspicion, and colonial law offered a measure of compensation if an enslaved person was executed for a crime, paid from public funds at a rate set by the court. This detail meant that owners had a direct financial stake bound up in the outcome of the trials to come, one that ran alongside, and sometimes in tension with, whatever personal loyalty or doubt they might have felt about the accusations against their own property. That compensation system had existed since the aftermath of the 1712 revolt, when the colony first recognized that prosecuting enslaved people for capital crimes carried an economic cost that owners, as the legal property holders, would otherwise bear alone. In practice, it meant an owner lost comparatively little by an enslaved person's execution beyond the labor itself, since the public treasury absorbed a portion of the financial loss, a structure that removed one of the few incentives an owner might otherwise have had to challenge a weak accusation on his own property's behalf. Cuffey himself was arrested within days of Earl's report, though the evidence against him at that point remained a single eyewitness account of him running near a fire, an act that could as easily have described someone fleeing a fire he had not started as someone fleeing one he had. No physical evidence tying him to the ignition of the fire at Hilton's stable was ever produced. It was in this atmosphere, 4 days after the Common Council's emergency session, that a name entered the record that would come to define the entire affair. Mary Burton, the 16-year-old indentured servant living in John Hewson's household. Burton had not been arrested in connection with any fire. She had been named as a witness in an entirely separate case, one that predated the fires and had nothing to do with arson at all. In February, weeks before the first fire at Fort George, a shop belonging to a merchant named Rebecca Hogg had been robbed of a quantity of silver coin, linen, and small valuables, and investigators tracing the stolen goods had followed a trail that led directly to John Hewson's tavern. The hog robbery had been carried out, according to the eventual burglary case, by Caesar and Prince, who broke into the shop at night and carried the stolen goods to Hewson, who paid them a fraction of the goods' value and resold the rest through his usual channels. Some of the stolen silver was later recovered from Hewson's house during a search connected to that earlier case, giving investigators physical evidence of exactly the kind that would be almost entirely absent from the far larger conspiracy case that followed. Hewson was suspected of receiving and reselling the stolen property, the same role he had played for years in smaller, unprosecuted cases, and Burton, as a member of his household, was called to testify about what she had witnessed. In her first appearance before magistrates in late February, Burton confirmed that stolen goods had passed through Hewson's tavern, implicating her master in receiving stolen property. But she said nothing about fire and nothing about any broader conspiracy, because at that point there was no fire to speak of and no conspiracy under investigation. Burton's position within the Hewson household was itself a source of leverage that magistrates were quick to use. As an indentured servant, she was legally bound to Hewson's household for a fixed term, unable to leave or refuse his instructions without risking punishment, which meant her testimony against him carried an unusual weight. She was accusing the very man who controlled her daily life and livelihood, and doing so placed her in a precarious position that magistrates could resolve, one way or another, through the reward now on offer. By late April, with 5 fires behind the city and a reward of freedom now on the table, Burton was brought before magistrates again, this time in a dramatically changed context. The theft case against Hewson was still open, but the questions put to Burton this time extended well beyond stolen silver, and she was reportedly told, in terms recorded by the presiding officials, that she would be committed to prison herself unless she disclosed everything she knew about the fires. Burton's testimony, given over the course of several sessions through late April and into May, grew with each appearance. In her earliest statements on the subject, she described conversations she said she had overheard at Hewson's tavern among a group of enslaved men, including Caesar and Prince, in which they discussed setting fires around the city. By her later statements, the scope had expanded considerably. Burton testified that the enslaved men had planned to burn the entire city, kill the white population as they fled their homes, and that Caesar himself would be installed as the colony's governor once the plot succeeded, with Hewson ruling over the enslaved population beneath him. She named Hewson, his wife Sarah, and Peggy Carey as full participants in the plot, present at meetings where the burning of the city was allegedly planned in detail. She testified that oaths had been sworn over a Bible, binding the participants to secrecy and to the plan, a detail that gave the alleged conspiracy the appearance of formal, premeditated organization rather than tavern talk, exaggerated by fear and incentive. One specific claim from Burton's later sessions illustrates how far the testimony had traveled from its starting point. She described a meeting at which Caesar allegedly outlined a plan to arm the city's enslaved population with weapons stolen from local shops and stored beneath the floorboards of Hewson's tavern, a claim investigators acted on immediately, tearing up the floor of the tavern in a search that produced no weapons of any kind. The absence of any physical evidence at the search did not weaken the testimony's standing in the eyes of the court. It was treated instead as confirmation that the conspirators had been careful, moving the weapons before they could be found, an interpretation that made every negative result compatible with the theory it was meant to test. Each new session added names. Where her first statements had described a small group centered on Caesar and Prince, her later sessions named a dozen or more enslaved men from households across the city, most of whom, by her account, she had seen only once or twice at the tavern, and knew mainly by first name or nickname. Magistrates recorded each edition without apparent skepticism, and each new name became grounds for a new arrest, which in turn produced a new prisoner who could be offered the same bargain Burton herself had been offered: testify and be treated with leniency, stay silent and be treated as guilty by default. The incentive structure that had begun with a single servant girl was, within days, replicating itself inside the city's jail. No one at the time raised, at least not in any surviving record, the more basic problem with testimony of this scope, that it required magistrates to believe a plan to overthrow an entire colonial government and install an enslaved dock worker as its ruler had been organized in the back room of a waterfront tavern, discussed openly enough for a teenage servant to overhear it repeatedly, and never once reported by anyone else present until the reward for freedom was placed on the table. The scale of what Burton described did not slow the investigation. It accelerated it. Within days of her fullest statements, warrants were issued for Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, John Hewson, Sarah Hewson, and Peggy Carey. Caesar and Prince were already in custody on an earlier, unrelated burglary charge from weeks before the fires began, a case in which they had been accused of breaking into a shop and stealing goods, a charge that now sat beside the far larger one Burton's testimony had introduced. Lieutenant Governor Clark, with the Common Council's support, moved to convene a special court of oyer and terminer, the tribunal reserved for the colony's most serious crimes, to hear what was now being described in official correspondence as a conspiracy to burn the city and murder its inhabitants. Presiding over that court would be a recorder of the city named Daniel Horsmanden, a lawyer and judge whose handling of the interrogations to come would determine, more than any other single factor, how far the accusations would ultimately spread and how many people would not survive them. Horsmanden had arrived in New York from England more than a decade earlier, building a career in colonial law and government that had made him, by 1741, one of the most senior legal figures in the colony, serving simultaneously as recorder of the city and as a member of the governor's council. He was, by the standards of his profession and his time, an experienced and capable jurist, which made the direction he would take the case in the weeks ahead not the product of incompetence, but of conviction. Colleagues who worked with Horsmanden in the years before 1741 described him as thorough and methodical, a man who kept detailed personal notes on the cases before him, a habit that would later produce the single most complete written record of the trials to come, published under his own name once the proceedings concluded. That same thoroughness, applied to a set of interrogations already shaped by financial incentive and inherited fear, would not slow the momentum building against the accused. It would instead give that momentum the appearance of careful, documented process. Horsmanden believed, from the earliest sessions, that Burton's testimony described a real and dangerous plot, and he approached each subsequent interrogation already persuaded of the conspiracy's existence, treating his task as confirming its scope rather than testing its truth. That conviction, more than any single piece of evidence, would shape everything that followed, as the court's methods for extracting confession moved from formal questioning into something considerably more coercive. By the second week of May, Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, John Hewson, Sarah Hewson, and Peggy Carey sat in the city's jail awaiting trial, joined within days by a growing number of others named in Burton's expanding testimony. The machinery that would produce New York's largest mass execution was now fully assembled, waiting only for the interrogations that would turn one servant's testimony into more than 100 confessions. What happened inside the jail over the following weeks would not resemble questioning in any ordinary sense. It would resemble something closer to a system, one built to produce a particular kind of answer, and refined, prisoner by prisoner, until it produced that answer with almost mechanical reliability. On April 21st, a grand jury was formally empaneled under the newly convened court of Oyer and Terminer, with a merchant named Robert Watts serving as foreman, and the colony's Attorney General, Richard Bradley, appointed to prosecute whatever indictments the jury returned. The individual interrogations conducted inside the crowded city jail over the weeks that followed operated on a logic entirely their own, one that had little in common with ordinary questioning. The grand jury itself was composed entirely of white property-owning men, drawn from the same merchant and artisan class, whose warehouses, stables, and homes had burned over the preceding weeks, a composition that meant the body deciding whether evidence justified prosecution shared, directly and personally, in the fear that evidence was meant to address. No enslaved person, free black resident, or indentured servant sat on the jury or held any formal role in weighing the charges brought against them. This lack of representation extended through every stage of the process that followed, from the composition of the grand jury to the petite juries that would eventually hear the trials themselves, ensuring that at no point in the proceedings did anyone with first-hand understanding of what daily life looked like from inside bondage sit in a position to question the assumptions the court brought to each new case. The grand jury's first task was to hear Mary Burton's testimony directly, and it continued meeting in session after session through the final days of April and into May, as her account grew from a small circle of names into the fuller conspiracy she would eventually describe. It was only once her testimony reached that fuller scope, naming Hewson, his wife, and Peggy Carey as central participants rather than bystanders, that the grand jury returned its first formal indictments against Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, John Hewson, Sarah Hewson, and Peggy Carey on charges of conspiracy to burn the city. Within days of those indictments, the number of people held in the city jail on related charges had grown past 20, and the physical space itself, a single stone building never designed to hold so many prisoners at once, was already straining under the numbers. Conditions inside the jail, described in scattered surviving accounts, were crowded and unsanitary even by the standards of the period, with prisoners held in shared cells regardless of the severity of the charge against them, separated more by the availability of space than by any classification of risk or offense. It was in these conditions, isolated from family and community, uncertain how long the proceedings would last, and increasingly aware of what had happened to those who had already confessed, that Horsmanden conducted his interrogations. It was inside this crowded jail that Horsmanden began the individual interrogations that would ultimately determine the fate of every person swept into the case. Prisoners were brought before him one at a time, away from the others, and presented with a choice that colonial law made entirely legal and that Horsmanden applied with total consistency. Confess, name others involved, and receive transportation out of the colony instead of execution, or maintain innocence and face trial on evidence that, given the climate, all but guaranteed a guilty verdict. Transportation, in this context, meant sale into slavery in a Caribbean colony, most often Jamaica or one of the smaller Leeward Islands, a fate that separated a person permanently from family, community, and everything familiar about their life in New York, but that left them alive, set against the alternative, a public hanging or a burning at the stake. Transportation functioned less as leniency than as the only door out of a room with exactly 2 exits, and every prisoner brought before Horsmanden understood the arithmetic before a single question was asked. This was not technically torture in the sense of physical pain inflicted to extract words. It was a structure built from the 2 things a condemned person values most: life and information, arranged so that only one path led away from the gallows. For a person already facing a court primed by months of fear to believe almost any accusation, the calculation was not complicated. The accused also faced this choice with almost no meaningful legal defense available to them. Colonial law at the time did not guarantee counsel to defendants in capital cases, and while the court did appoint attorneys to represent some of the accused, most notably in Hewson's case, the enslaved defendants who made up the majority of those charged had no comparable representation preparing a defense on their behalf, no ability to call witnesses of their own choosing, and no established right to cross-examine the very witnesses whose testimony, obtained through promised reward, was being used against them. Even where counsel was appointed, the resources available to mount a defense bore no resemblance to those available to the prosecution. Attorney General Bradley had months of accumulated testimony, the full cooperation of the jail's interrogators, and the authority to compel further confessions from prisoners awaiting their own trials, while defense counsel, where it existed at all, typically had days rather than weeks to prepare. No independent investigators and no comparable ability to gather testimony favorable to their clients from a population already convinced that speaking in an accused person's defense might itself invite suspicion. By the first week of May, the confessions had begun. One of the earliest came from a man named Sandy, enslaved in a household several blocks from Hewson's tavern, who told Horsmanden that he had attended meetings at the tavern where arson and rebellion were discussed openly, and who named several other enslaved men, previously unmentioned by Burton, as fellow participants. Sandy's confession followed the same rough architecture as several that came after it. Placed in the position of certain execution unless he cooperated, he confirmed the outline of the conspiracy that Burton had already described, added his own details to make the confirmation credible, and in doing so widened the circle of accused by several more names, each of whom would soon face the identical choice he had just faced himself. A man named Jack, enslaved to a baker, followed a similar pattern within days, as did a man known in the record only as York. Among those questioned in this same stretch of May was an enslaved man named Quack, married to the cook employed at Fort George, whose connection to the household at the center of the very first fire made him, from the moment his name entered the record, one of the investigation's most closely watched prisoners. Each new confession functioned less as an independent piece of evidence than as an echo of the ones before it, shaped by prisoners who had every reason to know, by the time they were questioned, roughly what confession Horsmanden was expecting to hear. Some of those brought before the court resisted the pattern for a time. Several prisoners maintained their innocence through repeated sessions, giving accounts that directly contradicted what earlier confessions had claimed about their involvement, only to be told that their denial itself was being treated by the court as evidence of guilt, since an innocent man, by the court's logic, would have no reason to withhold information others had already supplied about him. This inversion, in which silence confirmed guilt as surely as confession did, closed off the one response that might have slowed the process down. A prisoner who told the truth, if that truth was innocence, had no way to prove it that the court was prepared to accept, while a prisoner willing to confess to anything, true or invented, had a clearly marked path to survival. Peggy Carey's experience inside this system illustrates how completely it could reverse itself over time. In her earliest sessions, Carey denied any knowledge of a conspiracy and refused to implicate Caesar, the father of the child she was carrying at the time of her arrest, maintaining her denial through repeated questioning, even as other prisoners around her began to confess. Carey's continued denial did not protect her. She was convicted and sentenced to hang alongside Hewson and his wife, and it was only after sentencing, facing execution within days, that she reversed her position entirely, offering a confession that named several additional participants in exchange for a brief reprieve. The confession Carey ultimately gave differed in several particulars from what Burton and other prisoners had already told the court, naming a different set of meeting dates and, in places, a different account of who had been present at the tavern on any given night. These inconsistencies passed without comment in the court's records, treated as the natural variation of independent witnesses rather than as a sign that at least one of the accounts, quite possibly all of them, had been shaped more by the pressure of the moment than by memory of any actual event. Her reprieve proved temporary. Carey was granted a short postponement to allow her testimony to be recorded and used in other cases, then executed regardless once the court had extracted what use it could from her final statements, a sequence that demonstrated more clearly than almost any other single case that the promised leniency for cooperation was never a guarantee, only a possibility. The court retained full discretion to withdraw. News of the unfolding investigation traveled well beyond New York's own streets in these weeks, carried south and north by the same shipping networks that had brought word of the Stono Rebellion 2 years earlier. Newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia printed accounts of the New York conspiracy through May and June, often relying on second-hand reports that exaggerated the scale of the plot even further, feeding a colonial audience already primed by Stono to expect exactly this kind of coordinated uprising, and treating New York's unfolding trials less as a cautionary account of a legal process gone wrong than as confirmation that the danger was real and spreading. By the middle of May, the court had accumulated enough confessions, cross-referencing enough names, that the outline of the alleged conspiracy had grown from a handful of men meeting at one tavern into a citywide network involving dozens of participants across multiple households, several taverns, and, in some testimony, links to enslaved communities in New Jersey and further afield. No participant in this expanding record seemed to notice, or at least none recorded noticing, that the conspiracy's size was increasing in near-perfect proportion to the number of confessions being extracted through the promise of survival. Horsmanden's own journal, the document that would later become the primary surviving account of the entire episode, records this expansion without any apparent concern that the interrogation method itself might be producing the pattern it claimed only to be uncovering. He treated each new confession as independent corroboration of what had come before, rather than as the predictable product of a system in which every prisoner understood exactly what answer would save their life. That journal, published 2 years after the trials under the title A Journal of the Proceedings in the Detection of the Conspiracy, would become, for more than 2 centuries afterward, the primary lens through which the entire episode was understood, since Horsmanden had controlled both the interrogations that produced the testimony and the written record of what that testimony contained. A document written by the presiding judge, defending the very process he had run, became the closest thing history had to an objective account of events that his own methods had done more than anything else to shape. The confessions also began to change in character as the weeks passed, moving beyond simple accounts of tavern meetings into more elaborate claims involving ritual and symbolism. Several prisoners described oaths sworn on a Bible or over a burning coal, formal ceremonies that gave the alleged conspiracy the texture of an organized secret society rather than a loose network of desperate men trading stolen goods and complaints. Among the men swept into this expanding circle were several of the free black sailors who had been captured from Spanish vessels during the ongoing war and brought to New York as prisoners months earlier. Their presence in the conspiracy narrative followed naturally from suspicions that had existed since their arrival. Since a population already primed to associate Spain, Catholicism, and black uprising in a single continuous threat needed little persuasion to fold these men directly into the plot Burton and the confessing prisoners were describing. Several of these Spanish-speaking prisoners were interrogated through interpreters, a process that introduced its own layer of uncertainty into testimony already shaped by coercion, since nuance and qualification could be lost or altered in translation without any of the parties present being in a position to catch the error. At least 2 of these men would eventually be sentenced to death, their cases resting on testimony filtered through language they did not fully control, and offered by witnesses eager to demonstrate that the conspiracy reached, as officials had long suspected, all the way back to Spain itself. It was in this atmosphere of expanding testimony that the investigation crossed a threshold it had not previously approached. In early June, a soldier stationed at the fort named William Kane came forward with an accusation naming a white school teacher, John Urey, as a central figure in the conspiracy, not as an arsonist, but as its spiritual architect. Urey had arrived in New York only months earlier and supported himself teaching Latin and classical languages to the children of several merchant families. He was known in the city as a man of unusual religious learning, someone who could discuss scripture and doctrine with a fluency that set him apart from the ordinary tradesmen and laborers who made up most of the accused, and this same learning became, under the logic of the investigation, evidence against him. Little in Urey's actual background supported the specific charge that would eventually be brought against him. He identified himself as a non-juring Anglican, a member of a small faction within the Church of England that had refused, decades earlier, to swear loyalty oaths to the monarchs who took the throne after England's glorious revolution, a position that made him theologically unusual and politically suspect in the eyes of the colonial establishment, but that had nothing to do with Catholicism at all. Urey had already drawn some notice in the city before Kane's accusation, having been questioned briefly in late May after neighbors reported unusual visitors coming and going from his lodgings at odd hours, visits that Urey explained as private tutoring sessions but that, in the climate of the moment, had already marked him as someone worth watching. That earlier, minor suspicion gave Kane's far more serious accusation a foundation to build on, since the court could point to Urey's prior mention in the record as evidence that concern about him predated Kane's testimony rather than originating from it. That distinction, clear enough to anyone familiar with English religious politics, meant little to a city already primed to see hidden Catholic infiltration behind any unexplained misfortune. Uri's use of Latin in his teaching, his familiarity with religious ritual and doctrine beyond what an ordinary schoolmaster required, and the simple fact that no one in the city could easily verify his background or his ordination status, however he described it, were enough to make him plausible as a secret priest to a court that had already spent months treating implausibility as no obstacle to conviction. Cain testified that Uri had secretly administered Catholic sacraments to him, including what Cain described as a formal baptism into the Catholic faith, conducted with Latin prayers and ritual objects. He further testified that Uri had described himself in private conversation as an ordained Catholic priest operating in the colony under disguise, a claim that, if believed, transformed Uri from a suspicious eccentric into precisely the kind of hidden Catholic agent the city's deepest fears had long anticipated. Cain's own reliability as a witness went largely unexamined by the court, in the same way Burton's had gone unexamined months earlier. He was a young soldier with no independent corroboration for his claims beyond his own account, testifying at a moment when accusations of this exact kind, naming a white conspirator, carried a substantial cash reward, and testifying against a man who had no organized community or congregation in the city able to vouch publicly for his character or contradict the specifics of Cain's story. New York's Common Council, recognizing that the investigation had not yet produced a single white conspirator, despite months of testimony about a citywide plot, had by this point increased the reward specifically for information leading to the conviction of any white person involved. Cain's accusation against Uri arrived within weeks of that increased reward being announced, a sequence that the court did not treat as worth examining, though it mirrored precisely the incentive structure that had already shaped every confession extracted from the jail. Mary Burton, whose testimony had not previously mentioned Uri at all, despite months of expanding statements naming dozens of other participants, was brought back before the court once his name entered the investigation. In this session, her final and most consequential addition to the record, she testified that she now recalled Uri's presence at meetings at Hewson's Tavern, describing him as a man who had encouraged the enslaved participants toward their plan and promised them absolution for what they were about to do. The timing of this addition, arriving only after Uri's name had already been raised by another witness, and after the reward for naming a white conspirator had been increased, did not prevent the court from accepting it as confirmation. It became instead the connecting piece that tied a religious panic about hidden Catholic agents directly to the arson and rebellion narrative that had occupied the court for months, uniting the city's two deepest anxieties about enslaved uprising and about Catholic infiltration into a single alleged conspiracy with a single alleged mastermind. By the middle of June, the grand jury had returned indictments against more than 50 people, enslaved and free, black and white, on charges ranging from conspiracy and arson to, in Uri's case, a charge that effectively criminalized the practice of the Catholic faith itself under the guise of treason. Uri was charged not directly with arson, but under a statute dating to the reign of William III that made it treason for an ordained Catholic priest to remain in the colony, a law that had sat largely unused for decades and that required, for a conviction, only that the court believe he was in fact a priest. The indictments varied considerably in the specificity of the evidence behind them. Some named individuals against whom multiple confessions agreed on the same account of involvement, giving prosecutors at least the appearance of corroboration. Others rested on a single uncorroborated statement from a prisoner who had every incentive to name as many people as possible, since the court had given no indication that a confession naming few people would be received any less favorably than one naming many. Of the more than 50 people indicted by mid-June, roughly 2/3 were enslaved men, the remainder a mix of enslaved women, free black residents, and a small number of white New Yorkers, including Hewson, his wife and daughter, Peggy Carey, and, once his indictment was returned, John Urey. This distribution reflected less the actual demographics of who might plausibly have organized a citywide plot than the demographics of who, under the reward structure and interrogation methods in place, was easiest to accuse and hardest to defend. The court of Oyer and Terminer, having spent nearly 2 months accumulating testimony, confessions, and cross-accusations, was now prepared to begin the public trials that would translate this accumulated record into verdicts, sentences, and, for dozens of the accused, executions carried out within sight of the same waterfront streets where the affair had begun. The first trials were scheduled for the final week of May, beginning with Caesar and Prince, the 2 enslaved men whose names had anchored the case from its earliest days. Their trial, held before the court of Oyer and Terminer, lasted only a matter of hours, a pace that would become standard for nearly every case that followed. The trial proceeded with a jury drawn, like the grand jury before it, entirely from the ranks of white property owners, hearing testimony from Mary Burton and several of the confessing prisoners whose statements had by then already named Caesar as a central figure in the alleged plot. Neither man had defense counsel present to challenge that testimony, cross-examine the witnesses against them, or call any witness of their own in response. Both men were convicted, formally, on the earlier hog burglary charge rather than the broader conspiracy indictment, since the burglary case offered prosecutors physical evidence, the recovered stolen silver, that the conspiracy case largely lacked. The distinction mattered little in practice, since the court and the public understood the sentence as punishment for the alleged conspiracy, regardless of which specific charge produced the verdict on paper. The choice to try Caesar and Prince first, and to convict them on the one charge in the entire affair that rested on physical evidence rather than testimony alone, gave the court's opening executions a veneer of solid legal grounding that the 100 or more convictions to follow, resting almost entirely on confession and accusation, would never again approach. Caesar and Prince were hanged on May 11th, 1741, at a gallows erected near the city's public burial ground, in front of a crowd that colonial accounts describe as one of the largest public gatherings the city had seen in years. Shops closed for the morning, and residents from across all 6 wards made their way to the site, drawn by a combination of civic anxiety and the plain spectacle of a public execution, an event that in ordinary times drew a crowd on its own merits regardless of the circumstances behind it. Afterward, Caesar's body was left hanging in chains at the site, a practice known as gibbeting, intended to display the consequence of conviction to anyone who passed. Prince's body, by contrast, was released for burial, a distinction in treatment that the surviving record does not fully explain, though it may have reflected Caesar's larger role in Burton's original testimony and the court's desire to make an example specifically of the man it had identified as the plot's central figure. The gibbeted body remained in place for weeks, and its slow decomposition became, in the following months, the subject of a specific and widely repeated piece of local folklore. Residents began to claim that Caesar's corpse had turned progressively paler as it decayed, eventually appearing to observers as the body of a white man, an observation with an obvious physical explanation in the process of decomposition itself, but one the city chose instead to read as a sign, evidence of guilt or judgment made visible on the body of the condemned. In the days immediately following the hanging, several merchants who had lost property to the spring fires reportedly closed their shops for a half-day of Thanksgiving, a gesture the Common Council noted with approval in its minutes as evidence that the city's confidence was beginning to return. That confidence proved short-lived, since the interrogations feeding the court showed no sign of slowing in the weeks that followed, and each new arrest reopened, for the household and neighbors involved, the same fear the first executions had been meant to put to rest. Crowds reportedly continued visiting the gibbet for weeks after the execution specifically to observe this change, a detail that says less about Caesar himself than about a city that had, by late spring, developed an appetite for reading meaning into almost any observable detail connected to the case, however ordinary its actual explanation. 3 weeks later, on May 30th, the court carried out its first execution by burning. Quack, an enslaved man married to the cook at Fort George, and Cuffy, the man Abigail Earle had first accused of fleeing Hilton's stable in April, were convicted specifically of setting the fire that had destroyed part of Fort George on March 18th, the very first fire in the chain that had started the entire investigation. The choice of burning rather than hanging as the method of execution for these two men reflected the specific charge against them. Colonial law treated arson, and particularly arson connected to an alleged uprising, as a crime severe enough to warrant burning, rather than the standard sentence of hanging reserved for most other capital offenses, a legal distinction that made the punishment itself a public statement about the severity the court assigned to the crime of setting fire to the seat of the colony's government. Both men had confessed under interrogation, describing their roles in starting the fort fire in terms that satisfied the court's requirements for conviction. Quack's confession in particular had described a specific sequence of events, entering the fort through a service door using a burning coal carried from the kitchen, that gave prosecutors the kind of concrete physical detail Burton's earlier testimony about a broader conspiracy had generally lacked. At the stake itself, moments before the fire was lit, both Quack and Cuffy reversed their confessions publicly, telling the assembled crowd that they had lied under the pressure of interrogation and that no conspiracy of the kind described in court had ever existed. According to accounts preserved from the execution, Quack specifically stated that he had never set the fire at all, and that his earlier confession had been given only because he had been told it was his sole means of avoiding the very death he now faced regardless. Their recantations, delivered in the final minutes of their lives, with nothing left to gain from either truth or further deception, were recorded by witnesses present at the execution, including Horsmanden himself, who included the account in his own journal without drawing the conclusion that a recantation offered at the moment of death, when confession could no longer save a person's life, carried a very different kind of credibility than a confession offered in a jail cell, when confession was the only thing that could. The court proceeded with the execution as scheduled. Quack and Cuffy were burned at the stake before a crowd assembled specifically to witness it, an event that colonial accounts describe drawing a gathering comparable in size to the hanging 3 weeks earlier. Through June, the pace of trials and executions accelerated. On June 8th, 4 more enslaved men were hanged in a single proceeding, their trials conducted on the same afternoon, and their sentences carried out together the following morning, a consolidation that reflected less any legal efficiency than the sheer volume of cases the court now had queued for judgment. By this point, the trials themselves had settled into a routine that moved with unusual speed, even by the standards of the period. A typical case, from the reading of the indictment to the jury's verdict, occupied less than a single day, leaving little room for the kind of extended examination of evidence that might have exposed the inconsistencies accumulating across dozens of overlapping confessions. Among those convicted in this period was a man named Fortune, enslaved to a city merchant, whose trial record shows a defense consisting of little more than his own denial, unsupported by any witness willing to speak on his behalf. Against the accumulated weight of testimony from several previously confessing prisoners, who named him as present at meetings he insisted he had never attended. His case, unremarkable in its brevity and its outcome, was typical of dozens that moved through the court that June, each one a near copy of the last. Additional executions followed on June 12th, when John Hewson and his wife Sarah were hanged together, convicted on charges that rested almost entirely on the testimony of Mary Burton and the confessions extracted from prisoners who had, by that point, spent weeks inside a system built to produce exactly the testimony it received. Their trial had lasted less than a day. The same pace applied to nearly every case that summer, regardless of the number of lives a single verdict determined. The Hewsons' bodies were also gibbeted at the same site as Caesar's, and the same pattern of rumor that had attached itself to Caesar's decomposing corpse attached itself to theirs as well, with residents claiming that Hewson's body had darkened with time in a manner they read as confirmation of some hidden guilt, an observation offered with no apparent awareness that it directly mirrored the opposite claim being made about Caesar's body hanging nearby. Sarah Hewson's teenage daughter, also named Sarah, had been arrested alongside her parents earlier in the investigation and testified against them in the weeks before their trial, a decision that spared her own life but left her, at 15, without either parent and with a role in their conviction that would follow her for whatever remained of her time in the colony. Peggy Carey's own brief reprieve, granted only so the court could record and use her final testimony, ran out not long after. She had given birth in jail during the period between her sentencing and her execution, and her child, according to the sparse surviving record, was taken from her before she was hanged. A detail Horsmanden's journal notes only in passing, without further comment on what became of the infant afterward. Carey's execution closed out the last of the founding figures named in Burton's earliest testimony back in April. Of the 6 people first indicted by the grand jury, Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, John Hewson, Sarah Hewson, and Peggy Carey, every one had now been put to death, a fact the court appears to have treated as vindication of the process that had convicted them, rather than as a circle that had simply closed on itself. By midsummer, the court had tried and sentenced dozens of additional defendants, most of them enslaved men convicted on testimony that traced back, directly or indirectly, to Burton's original statements and the chain of confessions those statements had set in motion. Sentences varied. Some were hanged. Others, whose confessions had come earlier or had proven more useful to the prosecution in implicating further defendants, received the transportation sentence they had been promised, sold out of the colony to the Caribbean rather than executed, a fate that removed them from New York permanently but left them alive. Transportation meant, in practical terms, sale to a plantation economy considerably harsher than the urban trades and domestic work most of these men and women had known in New York, with mortality rates for enslaved laborers in the Caribbean sugar colonies running well above those in the northern mainland colonies, a fact well understood by colonial officials even as they offered transportation as the merciful alternative to execution. The ships carrying transported prisoners left New York's harbor through the summer months, their human cargo drawn from households across the city that had, only months earlier, known these men and women as neighbors, co-workers, and members of the same waterfront community that had gathered at Hewson's Tavern before any of this began. By the court's own later accounting, more than 70 people were transported out of the colony over the course of the summer, most of them enslaved people whose only documented offense was having been named by another prisoner desperate to survive. Several owners petitioned the court for compensation as their enslaved workers were sentenced to transportation or execution, invoking the same public fund that had existed since 1712 to reimburse owners for property lost to capital punishment. The council's minutes from these months include a running ledger of these payments, itemized by owner and by enslaved person, a bureaucratic record that reduced each conviction, however it had been obtained, to a line of monetary compensation processed alongside the ordinary business of city government. A handful of these petitions survive in enough detail to show owners requesting compensation within days of a sentence being handed down, sometimes before the sentence itself had been carried out, a promptness that suggests the financial dimension of these cases was, for at least some owners, never far from mind, even as the court's public language remained focused entirely on conspiracy, treason, and the safety of the city. The final major trial of the summer belonged to John Ury, held in late August, nearly 3 months after William Kane's initial accusation had introduced him into the case. The delay between his indictment and his trial, considerably longer than most of the cases that had preceded his, reflected the greater legal complexity of prosecuting a white defendant under a statute that had rarely, if ever, been tested in the colony's courts. Ury conducted much of his own defense, cross-examining witnesses directly, including Mary Burton, and pointing out, with some success in the eyes of later observers, the inconsistencies between her testimony against him and her earlier statements, which had never mentioned him at all, despite months of otherwise expanding detail. He pressed her directly on why a man she claimed to have seen repeatedly at Hewson's Tavern, encouraging an alleged conspiracy in explicit terms, had gone entirely unmentioned across dozens of prior sessions of testimony. Burton's answer, that she had simply not been asked about him specifically until his name arose through Kane, satisfied the court, though it left unaddressed why a witness who had volunteered so many other names unprompted had never once volunteered his. Ury's defense also challenged the underlying premise of the charge against him, arguing that no evidence beyond Kane's uncorroborated account and Burton's late addition supported the claim that he was an ordained Catholic priest at all, as opposed to the non-juring Anglican he had always identified himself as being. He called on his own knowledge of Scripture and doctrine to demonstrate, at some length, the theological differences between the non-juring position and Catholic teaching, an argument that required the jury to follow a level of religious detail well beyond what most of the trials that summer had involved. Several observers present in the courtroom later described Ury's composure throughout his own cross-examinations as unusual among the summer's defendants, a calm that some attributed to genuine innocence and others to the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to defending doctrine in front of skeptical audiences. The court was unmoved. Ury was convicted and sentenced to death under the statute making it treason for a Catholic priest to remain in the colony, a verdict that turned less on any specific proof of his ordination than on the jury's willingness, after 5 months of accumulated fear, to believe that a hidden priest was exactly the kind of figure this conspiracy had needed all along. In the days before his execution, Urey wrote and had printed a pamphlet addressed to the public, protesting his innocence and describing in detail what he characterized as the fundamental unreliability of testimony extracted through the promise of reward and the threat of execution, a document that circulated in the city even as preparations for his hanging continued. The pamphlet argued, in terms remarkably close to how the episode would eventually be understood by later generations, that a system offering freedom for accusation and death for denial could never be trusted to produce the truth, regardless of how many confessions it accumulated. He was executed on August 29, 1741. The last major figure to be put to death in connection with the conspiracy the court had spent 5 months investigating. By the time the court of Oyer and Terminer adjourned in the final weeks of summer, the totals it left behind were staggering for a city of 11,000 people. 17 people had been hanged. 13 more had been burned at the stake. More than 70 others had been transported out of the colony, sold into slavery in the Caribbean, or exiled outright, separated permanently from whatever family and community they had built in New York. More than 150 people, roughly 1 in 70 residents of the entire city, had been arrested and questioned in connection with a conspiracy whose actual existence, at the scale the court had come to believe in, was never established by any evidence independent of testimony obtained through the exact incentive structure that guaranteed its own expansion. Set against these numbers, the physical damage that had originally triggered the investigation looked almost modest by comparison. The fires themselves, roughly a dozen in total across the spring, had destroyed a fort's interior, several stables, a warehouse, and a scattering of outbuildings, causing significant but not catastrophic financial loss to a handful of property owners. The total value of property destroyed across every fire that spring, tallied from the Common Council's own records, came to a fraction of what the colony would spend compensating owners for the enslaved people it went on to execute or transport. A comparison the court itself never drew, though the ledgers that made it possible sat in the very same council minutes, documenting both figures side by side. No one had died in any of the fires themselves. The city that spent the summer of 1741 executing 30 of its own residents had done so in response to property damage that, whatever its cause, had cost not a single life until the court's own proceedings began taking them one by one. That imbalance between a spring of scorched stables and warehouses and a summer of gallows and stakes would remain the single most difficult fact for the colony to reconcile with its own account of events in the years that followed, one that Horsmanden's journal, published 2 years later in careful defense of the process he had led, worked hard to explain away without ever quite managing to resolve it. Mary Burton, whose testimony had set the entire process in motion, eventually collected the reward money the city had promised, £100, along with her freedom from the remainder of her indenture. What became of her afterward is not clearly recorded, though scattered later references suggest she left New York within a year or two of the trials, disappearing from the historical record as completely as she had entered it. No account survives of Burton expressing doubt about the testimony she had given, and no record indicates the court ever asked her to reconcile the scope of what she had described. An alleged plot spanning dozens of households and multiple neighborhoods with the physical limits of what a single 16-year-old servant could plausibly have witnessed firsthand over the course of a few months living in one tavern. The court's own momentum, which had accelerated for months, began to slow of its own accord as summer ended. not because any single piece of evidence had discredited the underlying conspiracy theory, but because the pool of plausible new names had begun to run out, and because a small number of voices, Urey's pamphlet among them, had started to raise questions in public about how a process built entirely on reward and threat could ever produce testimony a court should trust. Those questions, arriving only after 30 people were already dead, would shape how the city and the colony that governed it chose to explain, in the months that followed, what exactly had happened and why it had been allowed to go as far as it did. No single cause explains why a spring of stable fires ended in a summer of 30 executions. What explains it is the way several separate pressures, each one manageable on its own, arrived in New York at nearly the same moment and combined into something none of them could have produced alone. The disproportion itself is the place to begin. A dozen fires that killed no one and destroyed, by the Common Council's own accounting, a modest fraction of the city's total property became, within 5 months, the justification for the largest mass execution in the history of British North America. Understanding how that gap opened requires looking separately at each pressure feeding it, and then at the single mechanism that allowed all of them to compound rather than cancel each other out. The first of these pressures was hunger, a city coming out of its coldest winter in living memory. With grain prices still elevated and poor relief petitions still climbing through the spring, was a city whose laboring population, enslaved and free alike, had spent months absorbing scarcity without any comparable increase in wages or relief. Scarcity of that kind does not by itself produce false accusations, but it produces a population primed to interpret misfortune as the result of someone's deliberate action, since deliberate malice offers an explanation that pure bad luck does not. Hunger also sharpened a specific competition that had existed in New York's labor market for years without ever quite boiling over. Poor white laborers and enslaved workers competed directly for the same dock and trade work in a city where owners could undercut free wages by hiring out enslaved labor instead, and a bad winter made that competition feel more immediate to men already struggling to feed their own households. This tension did not require anyone to believe a conspiracy was real in order to make an accusation against an enslaved neighbor feel, on some level, satisfying rather than merely alarming. The mechanism at work here was not conscious calculation so much as a lowered threshold for belief. A well-fed, secure population confronted with a strange fire might wait for more evidence before assuming deliberate arson. A population already exhausted by months of cold and short rations had less patience for that kind of waiting and less appetite for an explanation, mere accident, that offered no target for the anger scarcity had already produced. The second pressure was war, and the specific shape that war had taken. Britain's conflict with Catholic Spain had filled New York's harbor with captured Spanish sailors, some of them free black men stripped of that status the moment they landed. Men with genuine grievance against the colony that held them, and no illusions about the justice of their situation. Their presence gave a population already anxious about scarcity a specific, visible target onto which to project a larger fear, one sharpened further by the arrival of news from South Carolina describing an actual uprising 2 years earlier, one that had killed real people and marched, however briefly, toward the freedom a rival empire had promised. New York's leadership did not need to invent a threat from nothing. It needed only to connect several threats that already existed separately: war, scarcity, a prior colonial revolt, and a resented population of recent prisoners into a single narrative that made all of them symptoms of one underlying plot. Religious suspicion layered a further logic onto this connection, one that did not require any of the accused to actually be Catholic in order to function. A colony taught for generations to treat Catholic Spain and Catholic France as existential enemies, and Catholic priests as agents of subversion by definition, had a ready-made explanatory framework available the moment anyone suggested that a hidden religious hand might be guiding events that otherwise seemed disconnected. John Urey's eventual prosecution did not introduce this suspicion into the case. It gave a suspicion that had been latent in the city's worldview since long before 1741, a specific, named target to attach itself to. The third pressure, older and more deeply embedded than either hunger or war, was the structural fear built into slavery itself as an institution. A city that held roughly one enslaved person for every 5 residents had, by simple arithmetic, built its entire economy on the forced and unpaid labor of a population large enough to end that arrangement by force, if enough of its members ever coordinated to try. This is not a hypothetical anxiety invented for the purposes of this account. It was the explicit reasoning behind the Black Code of 1712, a body of law written specifically to prevent enslaved people from gathering, moving, or organizing in any way that colonial authorities could not directly observe and control. A legal system built for decades around the assumption that enslaved people were a constant, latent threat did not need strong evidence to activate that assumption in 1741. It needed only a plausible trigger, and a string of unexplained fires supplied one. The same urban density that made New York's economy function. Enslaved dockworkers, domestic servants, and tradesmen moving daily through shared streets and shared taverns alongside free residents also made the city's leadership acutely aware of how little visibility it actually had into the private conversations and associations of the population it depended on and feared in equal measure. Plantation slavery, for all its brutality, offered owners a kind of surveillance that urban slavery structurally could not. Isolated fields, controlled movement, and a labor force kept apart from concentrated points of information like taverns and marketplaces. New York's enslaved population had none of that isolation, which meant the city's leadership could never be fully certain what was or was not being discussed beyond its own hearing. A gap that fear, once triggered, filled with the worst possible assumption. What made 1741 different from an ordinary year of scattered suspicion was not the presence of these pressures, since New York had lived with hunger, war, and the structural fear of slavery in various combinations for decades, without producing anything close to a mass execution. What made 1741 different was the specific mechanism the court adopted to investigate the fires once suspicion took hold, a mechanism that turned ordinary fear into an engine that manufactured its own evidence. Fire itself deserves particular attention as the trigger, since it possesses a quality few other crimes share. It is nearly impossible, once a building is ash, to determine with certainty whether it was set deliberately or began by accident, and it can be set by anyone with access to an open flame and a moment alone, leaving no weapon, no forced entry, and often no witness at all. In a city built almost entirely of wood and heated through the winter by open hearths and stoves, fire was also the one form of destruction capable of threatening the entire settlement at once. A single spark, carrying the potential in the right wind to destroy not one household, but every household nearby. This combination, a crime that was catastrophic in potential scale, nearly impossible to prove or disprove through physical evidence alone, and available to anyone regardless of strength or weapon, made fire an unusually convenient vehicle for a fear that had, for other reasons entirely, already been building for months. Where a fear of poisoning or physical assault might have implicated only the specific people plausibly near a specific victim, a fear of fire could implicate anyone who had ever been anywhere near any building in the city, which is to say it could implicate, given sufficient testimony, almost anyone at all. The reward proclamation offered by the Common Council in April, freedom and money in exchange for testimony, created an incentive structure with a single, predictable flaw. It rewarded the production of accusations without any corresponding mechanism for testing their accuracy. A witness who named 10 people received the same reward as a witness who named 1, and a witness who named no one received nothing at all, regardless of whether the truthful answer was that no conspiracy existed to describe. Daniel Horsmanden's interrogation method compounded this flaw rather than correcting it, by offering every accused prisoner the identical choice: confess and implicate others in exchange for survival, or maintain innocence and face near certain conviction on the accumulated word of those who already had. The court built a system in which truth and self-preservation pointed in opposite directions for anyone who was, in fact, innocent. Confession became the rational choice regardless of guilt, which meant the volume of confession the court accumulated said nothing reliable about the scale of any actual conspiracy, only about the scale of the incentive the court had created to produce one. This structure also compounded itself mathematically in a way the court never appeared to notice. Each new confession produced new names. Each new name produced a new prisoner facing the identical choice, and each new prisoner facing that choice had every reason to confirm, rather than contradict, whatever the previous confessions had already established, since agreement with the existing record was safer than introducing a version of events the court had no prior reason to expect. A single false start, one prisoner's fabricated or coerced confession naming a handful of innocent people, was structurally guaranteed to grow rather than correct itself, because every subsequent prisoner questioned about those same names faced overwhelming pressure to agree rather than to be the first voice contradicting an already established account. No institution within the process existed to check this dynamic. The grand jury and the trial juries were drawn exclusively from the same property-owning population that had the most reason to fear conspiracy and the least reason to doubt testimony confirming it. The defendants, overwhelmingly enslaved, had no right to counsel comparable to the prosecution's resources, no ability to compel favorable witnesses, and no standing to challenge the credibility of accusers whose reward depended on conviction. Every safeguard that might, in a different system, have slowed the process down or tested its evidence was either absent by law or unavailable in practice to the people who needed it most. Even the presiding judge, the one figure with the authority to demand more rigorous corroboration before accepting each new confession, had by his own account already concluded, within the first weeks of interrogation, that the conspiracy was real and extensive. Horsmanden did not approach the growing volume of testimony as a question still open to disproof. He approached it as a pattern to be documented and confirmed, and a system with no remaining skeptic in a position of authority had no mechanism left capable of stopping its own momentum. The colony's lieutenant governor, George Clark, might in theory have provided some check on the court's momentum from above, but his own correspondence with London throughout the summer shows a man reporting the conspiracy to his superiors in the same confident terms Horsmanden used in the courtroom, rather than a man asking pointed questions about the quality of the evidence supporting each new wave of arrests. A lieutenant governor persuaded that his own residence had nearly been destroyed by a deliberate plot was not well positioned to serve as the skeptical outside voice the process badly needed. Mary Burton's own position illustrates the mechanism at the level of a single individual. As an indentured servant with years remaining on her contract and no independent means of securing her own freedom through ordinary channels, she was offered, in exchange for testimony, the single most valuable thing colonial society had to give a person in her position. Whatever she believed she had actually witnessed at Hewson's tavern, the structure surrounding her testimony gave her every reason to expand it, and no institutional incentive whatsoever to hold it back or qualify it once she saw how the court received what she had already said. John Urie's case shows the same mechanism operating from a different angle, one aimed not at manufacturing new accusers, but at manufacturing the specific kind of villain a 5-month panic had, by midsummer, come to require. A conspiracy imagined at this scale, spanning dozens of households, and, by some testimony, reaching back to Spain itself, needed an organizing intelligence behind it, if it was to remain coherent as a single plot, rather than dissolving into a loose collection of unrelated grievances and unconnected fires. Urie's religious unorthodoxy, arriving in the record at the exact moment the reward for naming a white conspirator increased, gave the narrative the missing architect it had, by the court's own logic, needed all along. Within a year of the trials, the Colonial Assembly amended the Black Code to close what officials described as gaps the 1741 investigation had exposed. The revised law imposed harsher penalties, specifically for arson committed by an enslaved person, formalizing burning at the stake as the prescribed punishment, rather than leaving the method to a court's discretion case by case. Exactly the punishment Quack and Cuffy had already received before the law made it explicit. The revisions also tightened restrictions on gatherings still further, reduced the circumstances under which tavern keepers like Hewson could legally interact with enslaved customers, and increased penalties for anyone, enslaved or free, convicted of receiving stolen goods from an enslaved person without an owner's documented permission. Manumission, already difficult under the 1712 Code, became harder still, with new bonds and restrictions designed to discourage owners from freeing enslaved people at all. Lawmakers debating these revisions in the year after the trials referred repeatedly to the events of 1741 as settled proof that existing restrictions had been insufficient, treating the scale of the alleged conspiracy as established fact, rather than as the product of a specific and flawed interrogation process. Not one recorded voice in these debates raised the possibility that the true lesson of 1741 might concern the reliability of coerced testimony rather than the laxity of prior restrictions on enslaved people's movement and association. None of these changes addressed the process that had produced 30 executions from a set of unproven claims. They addressed only the behaviors, tavern gatherings, informal trade, unsupervised movement, that the court had decided, based on testimony it never subjected to independent verification, had enabled the conspiracy to form in the first place. The lesson the colony's lawmakers drew from 1741 was not that their process for weighing evidence had failed. It was that enslaved people needed still less room to gather, move, and speak beyond the direct supervision of those who held them in bondage. The final piece of why this episode happened, and why it was understood for so long afterward exactly as its prosecutors wished it to be understood, lies in who wrote its history. Daniel Horsmanden did not simply preside over the trials. 2 years later, he published a lengthy journal of the entire affair, a document that became, for more than 2 centuries, the primary, and in many cases the only detailed account historians had of what had happened in New York in 1741. A record written by the presiding judge, defending the legitimacy of his own interrogations and verdicts, was not a neutral history of the episode. It was closer to a legal brief, organized to demonstrate that the conspiracy had been real, and the court's response proportionate, than generations of later writers who relied on it inherited, often without fully realizing it, the same assumptions Horsmanden had built into his interrogations from the start. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, accounts of the 1741 conspiracy, drawn from Horsmanden's journal, treated its central claim that an extensive plot to burn New York and kill its white residents had genuinely existed as an established fact, requiring no further scrutiny, since the judge who had overseen the entire process had, after all, said so in exhaustive and seemingly meticulous detail. The very thoroughness that made Horsmanden's journal useful as a historical source, its transcribed testimony, its careful dates and names, also made it persuasive in a way that obscured how thoroughly that same testimony had been shaped by the incentives under which it was given. Only in more recent decades have historians working from the surviving trial records, colonial correspondence, and comparative studies of coerced testimony in other panics been able to reconstruct a fuller picture, one that treats the scale of the alleged conspiracy not as an established fact requiring explanation, but as a symptom of the process that produced it. That reconstruction does not claim total certainty about what, if anything, individual defendants like Caesar or Prince or Cuffy actually did in the early spring of 1741. It claims only that the court's methods made it structurally impossible to distinguish, from the confessions alone, an extensive real conspiracy from a fear that had learned to manufacture its own confirmation. This reassessment matters for a reason beyond correcting an old historical record. It changes where responsibility for the summer of 1741 ultimately belongs, shifting the weight away from the specific individuals accused, most of whom left no independent account of their own, to weigh against the testimony convicting them, and toward the structure of incentives, procedure, and inherited fear that made their convictions, true or false, close to inevitable once the process began. What this episode left behind, once the summer's executions ended and the court adjourned, was not only a body count. It was a set of legal habits, an amended slave code, and a template for how a city under pressure could convince itself, through a process that looked procedurally correct at every individual step, that it had uncovered a danger far larger than anything the evidence, examined honestly, could actually support. None of this required any single official to act in obvious bad faith. Horsmanden was, by every account, a diligent and experienced judge who kept careful records and followed the legal procedures available to him. The Common Council members who authorized the reward were responding, in good faith by their own understanding, to what appeared to be a genuine and escalating threat to the city they were responsible for protecting. Mary Burton was a 16-year-old servant facing pressure from adults with authority over her life, in circumstances that offered her almost nothing resembling a free choice about what to say. It is this absence of an obvious villain that makes the mechanism worth examining as closely as the individuals caught inside it. A system can produce a catastrophic outcome, 30 deaths from evidence that would not survive serious scrutiny, without requiring any single participant to be unusually cruel or dishonest by the standards of their own time. It requires only that the incentives line up in a particular way, that no check exists to interrupt them, and that enough people, each acting reasonably within the narrow position they occupied, contribute their piece to a whole that none of them fully saw or intended. The same observation applies to the enslaved prisoners who confessed and named others in order to survive. Judging their choices by the standard of a person facing no such threat misreads the situation entirely, since a false confession offered to escape the stake or the gallows reflects the rational response of someone trapped inside a structure designed to make survival and honesty mutually exclusive, not a personal failure of courage or character on the part of the person who confessed. The mechanism that produced New York's summer of 1741 was not invented that year, and it did not disappear once the court adjourned. It has a history before this episode and a history after it, and tracing that longer thread is the final piece of understanding why this particular panic still matters. What makes 1741 worth studying closely, rather than filing away as an isolated colonial curiosity, is precisely that it was not isolated. The same underlying architecture, fear meeting an incentive to accuse, meeting an authority willing to accept accusation as proof, has produced comparable outcomes in societies with very different laws, very different technologies, and very different specific fears, separated from one another by decades and sometimes centuries. Recognizing the pattern in New York in 1741 is useful mainly because the pattern did not stay in 1741. Nearly 50 years before the fires began, the same basic structure had already produced a different mass execution, an ocean away in scale but identical in mechanism. The Salem witch trials of 1692 rested on testimony obtained under conditions that offered accused people an almost identical choice: confess to witchcraft and implicate others and survive, maintain innocence and face the gallows. 20 people died in Salem before the colony's own governor halted the proceedings, and the parallel to New York decades later was not lost on at least some observers at the time, who noted the same reliance on spectral and coerced testimony driving both episodes forward. In Salem, as in New York, the pattern began with a small number of accusers whose initial claims might in isolation have been dismissed as the product of illness, rivalry, or ordinary fear. In both cases, a court chose instead to treat those initial claims as the opening thread of a much larger plot, and in both cases the machinery built to investigate that plot rewarded exactly the kind of testimony most likely to expand it. Massachusetts, unlike New York, eventually reversed course within its own generation, with the colony formally apologizing and offering restitution to the families of the executed within a couple of decades of the trial's ending. New York offered no comparable reckoning in the years immediately following 1741, and the men and women executed that summer received no equivalent acknowledgement from the colony that had convicted them. The difference between the two colonies' eventual responses is itself worth pausing on. Massachusetts had the advantage of a single, contained episode, 20 deaths over several months, concentrated enough in time and place that reversing course carried a clear, nameable set of victims and a clear, nameable set of decisions to reconsider. New York's conspiracy spread across an entire summer and implicating well over 100 people through a slow accumulation of testimony, offered no comparably clean moment at which the colony's leadership might have paused, admitted error, and reversed direction before the final executions in August. Scale itself, in other words, worked against correction. A panic that grows slowly, one confession and one new name at a time, never presents its participants with a single dramatic moment demanding reconsideration, the way a sudden reversal or a single discredited accuser might. Each individual step in New York's proceedings could be defended by the standards of the moment as a reasonable response to the step before it, which meant no one involved was ever forced to confront the full, cumulative absurdity of what the process had produced until the summer was already over and 30 people were already dead. Placed side by side, Salem and New York form 2 points on a line that extends well beyond either one. A third point, distant enough in time and circumstance to make the recurrence unmistakable rather than coincidental, appears 2 centuries later in a different city, under a different fear entirely. What connects Salem and New York is not a shared subject, witchcraft in one case, conspiracy in the other, but a shared architecture, a court willing to trade leniency for accusation, a jury drawn from the same anxious population the accusations were meant to protect, and no meaningful check capable of interrupting the cycle once it began producing its own evidence. This architecture did not end with either episode. It persisted in modified form as a permanent feature of how legal systems handle testimony obtained under pressure, long after both panics had been folded into history and treated as aberrations rather than as instances of a recurring pattern. The clearest continuation of that architecture in American law is the practice, formalized over the following centuries, of offering reduced charges or reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against a co-defendant, a practice that today operates under the language of cooperation agreements and plea arrangements, rather than the language of reward proclamations and confession for transportation. The core exchange, information in return for leniency, is the same exchange the Common Council offered the residents of New York in April of 1741, refined and formalized but not fundamentally altered in structure. The overwhelming majority of criminal convictions in the modern American system are resolved not through trial, but through negotiated agreements of exactly this kind, arrangements in which a defendant facing severe potential punishment weighs the certainty of a reduced sentence against the risk of a much harsher one, often with limited time and limited independent means to evaluate the strength of the evidence against them. Legal scholars examining this system have long noted that it creates pressure to accept responsibility or to provide testimony against others that operates independently of whether the underlying facts actually support guilt, a pressure structurally similar in its basic shape to the choice Horsmanden placed in front of every prisoner brought to him in 1741. This is not to say that modern plea arrangements and colonial interrogation share equal severity, or that the safeguards developed since 1741, rules of evidence, rights to counsel, standards of appellate review, count for nothing. They count for a great deal, and their absence in 1741 is precisely what allowed the process to run as far as it did without correction. The comparison is offered not to equate 2 very different systems, but to show that the underlying incentive, testimony traded for leniency, remains embedded in how legal systems function, requiring active and deliberate safeguards to keep it from producing the same distortions it produced in colonial New York. Modern legal scholarship has documented at considerable length what that structure predictably produces when left unchecked. Testimony shaped more by what a witness believes will secure their own benefit than by what the witness actually observed. Organizations tracking wrongful convictions in the United States have found false confessions and incentivized informant testimony among the most commonly recurring factors in cases where a convicted person was later exonerated by physical evidence unavailable at the time of trial, a pattern that echoes, across nearly 3 centuries, the exact mechanism that convicted Caesar, Prince, and dozens of others in 1741 on evidence that existed only because the court had made evidence profitable to produce. Research compiled from decades of documented exonerations shows that false confessions appear in a substantial share of wrongful conviction cases involving the most serious crimes, and that a significant portion of those false confessions were given under interrogation conditions involving explicit or implicit promises of leniency in exchange for admission of guilt. Jailhouse informant testimony, cooperating witnesses who trade information, true or invented, for reduced sentences of their own, appears with similar frequency in the same body of research. A category of evidence legal scholars have specifically flagged as carrying elevated risk of unreliability, precisely because of the incentive structure surrounding it. None of this later research existed to warn the court that convicted Caesar and Prince, or the jury that sent Quack and Cuffy to the stake. What it offers, from a distance of nearly 300 years, is confirmation of something the men and women recanting their confessions at the moment of execution in 1741 already understood without the benefit of any formal study. That a system offering survival in exchange for accusation will, with reliable and predictable regularity, generate accusations whether or not the underlying conspiracy they describe is real. The 20th century offered its own version of the same underlying pattern, in a period distant enough from 1741 to make the structural echo instructive rather than partisan. During the anti-communist investigations of the 1950s, individuals facing loss of employment, reputation, or liberty were, in a considerable number of documented cases, offered a path to safety through naming others as sympathizers or participants in activity the investigating bodies deemed subversive. Congressional committees and private employers alike relied on testimony from witnesses whose own security depended on providing names, and blacklists compiled from that testimony ended careers based on accusations that, much like the confessions extracted in 1741, were rarely subjected to independent verification before being treated as established fact. The specific fear differed entirely from New York's fear of arson and uprising, but the mechanism connecting fear to testimony and testimony to further accusation followed a structure a court in 1741 would have recognized immediately. In both cases, a person facing an accusatory body could improve their own position primarily by providing additional names. In both cases, the resulting list of the accused grew largely in proportion to the incentive offered, rather than to any independently verified scope of wrongdoing. And in both cases, meaningful public reckoning with the unreliability of that process arrived only after the damage, professional and human in the 20th century, physical and fatal in the 18th, had already been done. None of these later episodes required anyone involved to have read Horsmanden's journal or to have consciously modeled their methods on colonial New York. The recurrence is not the product of imitation. It is the product of a structural vulnerability built into any legal or investigative process that rewards accusation without independently testing its accuracy, a vulnerability that reappears whenever fear, incentive, and unchecked authority happen to align, regardless of the specific century or the specific danger the fear is organized around. Awareness of this vulnerability has, in the centuries since 1741, produced deliberate institutional responses aimed specifically at containing it. A number of American jurisdictions today require corroborating evidence before a jury may convict based substantially on the uncorroborated testimony of a jailhouse informant or a cooperating co-defendant. A rule that exists precisely because courts and legislators recognized, eventually, that testimony purchased with leniency carries a measurably higher risk of fabrication than testimony offered without that incentive attached. Some jurisdictions require juries to be instructed explicitly about the reliability concerns associated with informant testimony, treating the category itself as one demanding extra scrutiny rather than automatic trust. These safeguards exist because the underlying vulnerability was recognized, named, and studied, not because it was ever eliminated. A rule requiring corroboration reduces the risk that a single incentivized accusation can, by itself, produce a conviction. But it does not remove the incentive itself, and it offers no protection at all in any system, formal or informal, that has not adopted the safeguard in the first place. Colonial New York had no such rule. The court that convicted Caesar, Prince, and the more than 100 others charged that summer needed nothing beyond the accusation itself, offered by a witness with every reason to offer it, and confirmed by other witnesses facing the identical incentive. It is worth remembering that this critique was not entirely absent even in 1741 itself. John Urey's pamphlet, written and printed in the days before his own execution, argued the essential point that later legal reform would spend centuries formalizing, that testimony obtained through the promise of reward and the threat of death cannot be trusted as if it were freely given. The argument did not save Urey's life, and it did not slow the court that had already convicted him. But it stands, in the surviving record, as evidence that the flaw at the center of this entire episode was visible to at least one person living through it, articulated clearly enough that a reader nearly 3 centuries later can recognize the same reasoning underlying modern rules of evidence. The specific crime at the center of 1741, arson, has its own separate thread running forward into the modern era. One worth noting given how directly the fires themselves triggered everything that followed. For much of the 20th century, arson investigation in the United States relied heavily on visual indicators, patterns of burn marks, glass fracture, and char depth, that investigators had long treated as reliable signs of deliberate, accelerant-fueled fire. Beginning in the 1990s, controlled fire science experiments demonstrated that many of these long-trusted indicators occurred just as readily in accidental fires as in deliberately set ones, findings that led national fire investigation standards to be substantially rewritten, and that have, in the years since, contributed to the exoneration of people convicted of arson on evidence investigators sincerely believed, at the time, was scientifically sound. The parallel is not exact, since the flawed arson science of the 20th century involved honest investigators working from mistaken assumptions rather than a system deliberately structured around incentivized testimony. But the underlying lesson rhymes across both cases: a colony in 1741 and a modern fire marshal's office more than 2 centuries later. Both convicted people of arson based on evidence each era believed, in good faith, was solid, and both were eventually shown, through methods unavailable to them at the time, to have been working from evidence far less certain than the confidence of their verdicts suggested. The physical trace of 1741 in New York itself remained, for more than 2 centuries, largely invisible within the modern city that grew up over the ground where the trials took place. Those executed that summer were buried without ceremony or individual marking, their remains placed in common ground on the outskirts of the Colonial settlement, in the same general area later used as a burial ground for the city's enslaved and free black population throughout the 18th century. That burial ground, in use from the late 17th century until it closed in the 1790s, is estimated by archaeologists to have held the remains of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people over the course of its operation, the majority of them enslaved or free black New Yorkers, denied burial in the city's church cemeteries reserved for white residents. As the city grew northward, and the ground was built over repeatedly across the 19th century, the burial ground's existence faded from public memory almost entirely, surviving mainly in old maps and scattered documentary references rather than in any physical marker. That burial ground was built over entirely as New York expanded northward through the 19th and 20th centuries, its existence largely forgotten until construction crews preparing a new federal office building in Lower Manhattan uncovered human remains in 1991. The discovery halted construction for a period and prompted a formal archaeological excavation, one of the largest of its kind ever conducted in North America, recovering the remains of more than 400 individuals, along with grave goods and burial patterns that offered historians and archaeologists a far richer picture of 18th century black life in New York than any single written document had preserved. The discovery led to the identification of the site as what is now preserved and commemorated as the African Burial Ground National Monument, a few blocks from where Hewson's Tavern once stood, and not far from where the gallows and the stake were raised in the spring and summer of 1741. The site was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1993 and formally established as a national monument in 2006, with a visitor center and memorial now standing on ground that, for most of the 20th century, sat beneath office buildings and parking lots, with no public indication of what lay beneath. Analysis of the excavated remains gave researchers detailed evidence of the physical toll enslaved labor took on the bodies of those buried there, including bone stress patterns consistent with heavy, repetitive physical work performed from a young age, alongside grave goods and burial orientations that suggested some individuals were interred according to West African spiritual traditions, carried across the Atlantic and preserved in some form, even within a colony that denied the people practicing them any formal recognition of their own religious or cultural identity. The excavation remains one of the most significant sources of physical evidence available anywhere for understanding the lived experience of New York's enslaved population in the exact period this account has described. Visitors to that monument today walk within a short distance of the ground where 30 people were executed on testimony a modern court would not accept, in a case built by a system that rewarded accusation and punished doubt in equal measure. The monument commemorates the broader population of enslaved and free black New Yorkers buried there across an entire century, not the 1741 executions specifically, but the proximity itself is not incidental. It reflects the same city, built on the same forced labor, governed for generations by the same structural fear that made this single summer possible. What happened in New York in 1741 did not end with the last hanging in August. It continued in modified and softened form, embedded in the tools a legal system reaches for whenever fear outruns evidence, and someone in authority needs an answer faster than careful proof can supply one. None of the 30 people executed that summer received a retrial, an apology, or a formal exoneration from the colony that convicted them. No court in New York's subsequent history has ever formally revisited the verdicts of 1741 in the way Massachusetts eventually revisited Salem, which means the record technically remains, in the eyes of the law that produced it, closed and settled. What has changed is not the verdict, but the frame historians and the public now bring to reading it, understanding those verdicts as artifacts of a flawed process, rather than as settled fact about the people it condemned. That shift, from treating the confessions as truth to treating them as evidence of the system that extracted them, is itself the long thread this account has tried to trace. It is visible in the corroboration rules some courts now require before accepting informant testimony. It is visible in the forensic standards rewritten after fire science exposed how much of what investigators once trusted had never been tested. It is visible in the archives historians now read against their author's evident interest, rather than at face value, and in the ground beneath Lower Manhattan, once forgotten and now marked. That holds the remains of a population the colony that built New York depended on and feared in equal measure. The names have changed. Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, Quack, Peggy Carey, John Hewson, John Urey. Their case remains. In its outline, a pattern the world has not yet finished learning to recognize. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.